All right, gentlemen, this is going to be fun. I'm much happier talking in this format. And I mean, we already kind of talked in the thing that will show up at Realms Deep itself about, all the logistical crap that goes into making a movie like this. I mean, we have essentially the film expert here and the subject matter expert on first person shooters, as you said. You even wrote a book, you said, about it, David? Rocket Jump.
Yes. Yeah, Rocket Jump, Quake, and the Golden Age of
Yeah.
first-person shooters, and yeah, it was really fun. Published through Shack News. You can read it for free actually right now at shacknews.com.
So, I mean, we're going to have to dig into that. This is in the keep has been just all about bringing the limelight of not just the 90s, but what its influence has been on what essentially has been a new wave of boomer shooters, as we call it, over the past couple of years. Essentially, since Dusk came out, there were a few before, like Strafe or Rack, that attempted it, and I think were actually quite good, but just didn't. You catch lightning in a bottle once every few years, maybe. And for whatever reason, David Szymanski and Dave Oshry just nailed it with Dusk. Um, but that game was essentially like, remember all the things that you liked about the games in the 90s? What if we removed all the things that you don't like and just keep the good and do that? And that's what we got. But for you, you wrote a whole book on the subject. What is your feeling? What was the golden age in your mind?
I think it was the '90s because of flavor. The '90s for first-person shooters is like when you walk into a frozen yogurt store or an ice cream store and you see like 86 flavors spread out, and you can get them in any combination you want. I mean, you had games like Doom, and in fact, until the term first person shooter kind of caught on, they were known as Doom clones. But then
Mm-hmm.
you started getting a lot of variety. You had Duke Nukem, which aside from the episode where you go up to the moon, was set on Earth and had very sort of pseudo realistic level design. You could go through strip clubs, bathrooms, movie theaters, and interact with stuff. I mean, while you were shooting pig cops, you could play billiards at a pool table. And then you had games like Quake and Unreal and Kingpin, where you're kind of like in a street gang. Wheel of Time, which is probably my favorite epic fantasy book series and the best epic fantasy book series. There's a game about that. But as you went into, I would say by 2006 or 7, really with the advent of Call of Duty 4, FPS, at least AAA blockbuster, big budget FPS, kind of became homogenous. It became very, very militarized. And there's nothing, I'm not trying to make an ethical statement about that theme, but you lost that flavor. It's kind of like your ice cream bar shrunk from 86 flavors down to like two.
And we even
And
have that transition between Quake 1 and 2, as a matter of fact. Like, it
oh,
goes from
yeah.
being this, Lovecraftian fantasy game to being essentially like a Space Marine Doom clone to some extent.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah, it really was. I mean, in fact,
yeah,
that's one of the things I wrote about. Like, they even talked about how the name Quake meant nothing. It was just a brand. There was never any carryover in terms of story or characters. It was just like, this is the next Quake. What does Quake mean? Well, it means fast paced arena style shooting. And so when I wrote Rocket Jump, the core or the epicenter, if you will, is the development of the Quake trilogy and how that kind of took a toll, for better or worse, on the culture within id Software,
yeah.
good, bad, and ugly. But around that, I thought, you know what? Let's look at some of the games that Wolfenstein 3D, but especially Doom and Quake inspired. And so I wrote about the development of the original Team Fortress mod, which was a mod for Quake. That's how that started. I wrote about the making of Star Wars Dark Forces, which was, again, going back to flavor. Like, you could be in the Star Wars universe using all those blasters with the authentic soundtrack and the pew pew of the blasters as you were shooting. It felt like you were there. And so it was really cool to get to talk to all these people like John Romero. I got to talk to John Carmack. In fact, when I emailed him, he said, "Oh yeah, I'd love to. I love your work." And that was one of those moments where I was like, "What? Like, what is my life?" And when Robin contacted me, I just thought, I've been wanting to make, whether it's a TV show or a documentary or a dramatization about Rocket Jump, because it's a story that really needs to be told. And so it was almost kismet, at least for me. It was like, yes, finally here's someone who sees the potential.
So you mentioned how Quake's lore, I guess, really just kind of doesn't exist to some extent.
Lore. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
Retroactively,
Yeah.
they've attempted to pull it back together. So I say that to say there's like the reason why In the Keep is called In the Keep and has this big octopus logo. Um, Contrary to popular belief, it is not Hail Hydra. Because that was funny last year. Because we were wearing like the red logo shirts when we
Yeah.
attacked Mike J, and which I thought was fucking funny, but like I didn't realize how people were gonna read it, and I was like, "Ooh, shit."
Yeah.
But anyway, the point being that the reason why In the Keep is called In the Keep is because originally it was called Cathala's Keep, and
Hmm.
Cathala being like the Lovecraftian successor to Cthulhu
Hmm.
was a major player in the lore of Quake.
Yes.
And I was looking like, well, we got to do something like that. That'd be really cool. That's kind of what the show's theme is anyway. And originally, it really was just about arena FPS and talking about Quake and games like Quake and
Hmm.
Quake mods and on and on. Until I ran out of material and I was like, all right, let's start talking about all these other cool games too. And
Yeah, you probably know about then Sandy Peterson. Like he actually came from a background of designing Lovecraftian board games and mythology, and so when he came to id, he worked on Doom. But then when Quake came up, he was like, "Oh, this is my jam right here."
yeah, I had to find some little way to try to like sneak that in, but like that's why at the beginning of the show it still says like this is all in service of the drowned god Cathala shit, because I'm a
I love it.
huge dork when it comes to stuff like that.
Yes, same.
Yeah. Apologies now, Robin. We're already like what was it, 5 minutes in? We just dived right into a bunch of shit that I don't
You
think
guys
you
are just like,
care
you can
about.
go down your rabbit holes. I'm learning. In my head, I've got this is like a lecture, right? And I just want to soak it all up.
That's
Um,
right.
with Lovecraft, with our previous 80s horror documentaries, we obviously covered Reanimator, um, which was a big sort of Lovecraft
Mhm.
inspired movie. So that's what I was thinking about.
I figured you were probably thinking about that. So yeah, we'll get Sandy to talk about that. And in
Yeah.
fact, one thing John Romero sent me a few years ago when I was writing this book he asked me not to show it to anyone, so I didn't. He let me publish like a page, but it'd be really cool to show during the documentary. I have the full design document from Quake, what it was originally envisaged as, and there is so much more intricate than what they were able to ship. Because if you know the history of Quake, and I do get into this in Rocket Jumper, we're definitely going to discuss it in FPS, but it was really hard development. I mean, they were working around the clock, and a lot of John Romero's vision for that game didn't really come together. As you know, each of the 4 episodes you start in a military base, and then from there you're like in Lovecraftian castles, and you're like, well, that was kind of a jarring leap thematically, but they're actually those are all supposed to be interconnected in a big hub world where you'd be taking the slip gates, which factored into Quake's, like one paragraph story in the manual, whatever it ended up being, that took you from these far flung futuristic military bases into the heart of this horror Lovecraftian setting. And so it's really fascinating stuff.
It's it's absolutely mind blowing how even though all of that stuff got cut and didn't really make it into the limelight, like the community, which is where I've been mainly focused on, have just taken it and run with it. And
Mm-hmm.
now it's very common in the Quake mapping community, which for whatever reason is like fucking huge. And I mean, probably we could get into that actually. There's a reason for it, and I think I understand why. But the the community, they'll say like it's a base map or it's a castle map, or like, and that's a very just kind of common easy thing for them to talk about. And then they understand the whole slipgate scenario and that we're going into different worlds. And that's kind of harkening back to. Are you guys familiar? You know who? What's his name? Weinstein, not Harvey, not Brett, his brother. Either way, he did this podcast called Portal, the Portal, and he was talking about how like in all fantasy, there's this concept that especially for children's fantasy, like Through the Looking Glass or like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Harry Potter, this idea that everybody kind of harkens to that desire to kind of like escape the real world and just walk through a threshold or a wardrobe or whatever it happens to be, and be in this fantasy. And that was such a, I don't think it was on purpose, but it was a very easy thing for people to just kind of like accept and transition into and understand, even if they didn't fully know how to word it or where it came from.
It's really about taking these
Yeah.
concepts that are generally understood and packaging them in a way that your audience will understand. Lovecraft wrote very adult oriented horror, obviously, but his the underlying theme to all of his stories is this unseen world, and that applies to everything you described. Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe, Harry Potter. There's a world that kind of overlaps with ours. You just don't see it, and so it's the same sort of concept, but just packaged in a different sort of way to
Yeah.
make it more appealing to a different audience.
It's Eric Weinstein, by the way.
Eric
I feel,
Weinstein. There we go.
yeah.
The third Weinstein. Yeah, there we go.
But he was like a mathematician talking about this shit, and I'm like, man, he probably understands something that I don't.
Math is the universal language, even in those worlds.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think recently he published like his kind of not theory of everything, where he's trying to like mathematically come up with an idea that sums up the universe. Yeah, there's been many attempts to do that, but just people thinking on that level blow my mind. And strangely, many of them happen to also be people who like enjoy making video games for some
Well,
reason.
John Carmack.
Yeah.
I've thought a million times, like, why isn't this guy at NASA? Why is he making? This guy builds first person shooters by day, or he did during his time at id, and then he'd go home and play with rockets. In fact, there's a great story in Rocket Jump. Sandy Peterson told me when you were walking through id's offices, you'd have to be very careful not to like accidentally trip over cans of flammable and explosive liquid that Carmack just kept lying around for whatever he was building. By the way, we need to get a hold of Eric and save him a lot of work. Somebody should already tell him that the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42. Like, so we've already figured it out. So,
uh, Man. So you want to talk about sci-fi shit? I don't. Hitchhikers was definitely not kind of in your '80s documentary,
No, well, so
but
um, it's called In Search of Tomorrow. So it's the poster. Oh, I'm mirrored here. Yeah, there's that poster there. Okay. Um, so it's actually the highest grossing crowdfunded documentary in history. We've got about 11,000 backers, and it's going to be amazing. But we don't cover Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's TV. So it's really focused on American movies from the 80s. And it's funny, as I'm talking to you, I'm getting notifications because rough cuts are coming through the edit suite.
Mhm.
And the sequences that I'm watching on the films we're covering have been like outstanding. So I'm already excited. That comes out, that the film itself will be finished in December.
that's it's going to be really interesting to see because you can correct me. I'm sure you're far more knowledgeable about this than I am, but I always kind of felt like the '80s was like a weird. Maybe that's why you're doing a doc on it, but it's not like the best time necessarily for horror movies or for anything film wise because I feel like there was a dichotomy. There's a transition out of the '70s when directors, like big directors, like things like The Exorcist were coming out, The Shining, huge directors with giant budgets were making horror movies, and it was just an accepted thing. Even though it wasn't mainstream, it was accepted because they were doing it. In the '80s, essentially what 79 Evil Dead comes out somewhere in that
It
area.
was 80 or 81 Evil Dead. It was the 80s.
Okay, early on, Evil Dead is kind of like one of those first really big cult hits that was made on a shoestring budget, and then after that, lots of other. I think the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in the '70s too.
That was in the
Um,
70s. So the one that really broke
yeah,
80s horror was probably Friday the 13th.
yeah,
And so I got to spend time with the guy that created that, Sean C. Cunningham.
hmm
He also did the House movies and a whole bunch of other films. But it was just fascinating. I mean, the 70s was the era of the director, okay? But the 80s, there's something magical about the 80s because there just was no boundaries. It was just about excess. It was just about going all in, right?
yeah,
No limits. Greed is good. And Reaganomics and, nuclear war imminent. And that filtered through to the psyche into all these facets of art. And we've kind of honed in on 80s horror and 80s sci-fi because there's so much more going on. I mean, these documentaries are hugely nostalgic. I mean, people have them just playing in the
yeah.
background as a comfort blanket, right? And we're going to have close to 75 contributors for the sci-fi documentary. Um, and it's going to be hugely nostalgic, but it's also going to. This is why I love what I do, right? So we know if we get something right with one of our films, if it takes something you already know a lot about and helps you re-experiencing it in a new way, right? So what I mean by that is if I sort of extrapolate over to FPS, I want you to feel like when you first played these games. Okay, I want you to feel that sense of rush when you finish watching this documentary. I want you to rush out and start playing old FPS games or dig out games you never played that you missed because there's so many.
Yeah.
It's going to be very unusual to find someone that's played them all and knows them all. That's how we know we've done our job right. But how you win is you create an experience for the audience where they get to relive their joy for that particular title. And that's what's really special about the kind of entertainment we produce, because I think that's what we focus on.
Do you cover the resurgence of Star Trek during that time period at all?
No, we don't. We actually no, we do, because we cover the movies. I think there was two movies, or actually three Star Trek movies in the 80s. So we've got Walter Koenig, who was Chekhov. He's in the film. We've got the director of The Wrath of Khan, just names escapes me, in the film. We've got a whole bunch of people from Star Trek in Search of Tomorrow, but they're talking about the movies. So you've got to kind of separate that from the TV series.
Yeah.
But it's all very exciting. I mean, Wrath of Khan is arguably the best Star Trek movie.
For me, it's not. I think First Contact is the best.
Okay.
But we could argue about.
I went to see, just before the pandemic hit in the UK, I went to see William Shatner on stage, and his arrival on stage preceded a screening of Wrath of Khan. I think it's Nicholas Meyer who directed it. Nicholas is in our documentary, so we've already filmed that interview. It's just fascinating, and it still stands up as a great movie, and with so many iconic moments and scenes and all of that kind of stuff. But I'm in Search of Tomorrow, because that's going to come out before FPS. That will be the best thing we've ever done, and probably the most challenging as well, because we've had to do a lot of it through the pandemic. But that's a challenge we overcame.
What are some of the kind of landmark movies that you are or do want to cover?
Well, this is the first major interview for Peter Weller, who obviously is RoboCop. Pick an 80s sci-fi movie and we're covering it. I mean, we've got E.T., we've got Dee Wallace from E.T., we've got we're still casting. We've still got some top of the food chain names to announce that I can't talk about yet. But with Predator and Running Man, we've got Jesse Ventura. He was amazing.
Jesse the Body Ventura, man.
The Body Ventura.
If you got me in a room with him, we would be talking about wrestling the whole time.
He everything you think about him, he's like 10x. So his interview was like fire, right?
The scene in Predator when he spits on Apollo Creed, I can't see him the other way. Spits on his shoe, and then that's a nasty habit you got there. This shit'll make you a sexual tyrannosaurus.
Like I love that, and but he's very, very intelligent man, but he still has that gizmo. But huge. I mean, that was one of my standout interviews so far. But there's been so many. I mean, God, we've probably shot already like 40 something interviews. Talking of Star Trek, we had Will Wheaton last week.
Oh my God!
We've got Joe Dante. We've got just so like icons, and it's been amazing. It's such a privilege, and I can't wait. Like, I love 80s horror, and it was my first big long form doc that I set up. But
making me so jealous.
Yeah,
I'm changing the theme of my show.
I mean, the Terminator. You got the Terminator, Predator, Alien. We got Carrie Henn. We got a few people from Aliens already. Carrie Henn played Newt. we've got a few people from Aliens as well, and quite a few of the um, like makeups and effects people and writers and all of that kind of stuff. So you're getting all these unique perspectives,
Yeah.
and it takes something, like we've all seen Aliens like a million times, right? Or Predator a million. You're quoting Predator. That's how much you've seen it, right? And so our job is to kind of get you to understand it and experience those moments in a new way, right? And when that happens, it's great. I look at YouTube a lot, especially when I've been, YouTube inspired my decision to go in and make a documentary about FPS, because I saw so many creators dedicating whole channels around this, and I was like, wow, this is really deep. This is, visceral memories.
Yeah.
And
G-Man, Civi,
yeah, well, G
those
Man's in
guys.
the film, right? And there's Civi, and there's a whole bunch of people who are amazing, and that's what inspired us. But the opportunity we have is just logistical, So we're able to go out and get everyone together. These projects take a long time to put together, but ultimately it's a love letter to the genre, and um, I can't wait. We're in the thick of it right now. We're at war in a Kickstarter. Crowdfunding is a full contact sport,
Yeah.
but I'm loving it, and I absolutely adore the team we have, because there's no room for weakness. You can't have a weak link with the way we operate and how we do things. And I'm just really grateful.
All right, I'm about to do the mother of all transitions. I'm setting up for a 3-pointer right here. Ready?
Oh, let's see it.
So, 80s sci-fi and horror in general, the children of that generation grew up to make all of the games that we love from the 90s. How
100%.
many references in
Swish.
90s games come directly from things like The Evil Dead, like RoboCop, like all of that stuff?
It's amazing. It's amazing, and I can tell you about my experience of FPS games, right? So I wouldn't classify myself as a gamer. The two eras of my life that involved gaming were when I was a kid on the 8-bit, loved it, and then I sort of got into girls and whatever else, and kind of left it alone. And then in my early 20s, I was I think my mum bought me an Xbox, and it came packaged with Halo 2, and I played Halo 2, and I was like, this is the most amazing cinematic experience I've ever had. Like, it blew my mind. And that game had, well, the Halo franchise has so many references to Aliens, to other films. It's insane. And everything is a remix. So as we progress in the future, all these great ideas and iconography will get reversioned. And it was so part. It's weird now, because when I rewatched Aliens recently, and it reminds me of Halo. So the whole thing goes full circle, and I love it. And that's what great ideas should become. They should be immortal. They should constantly be reborn in new
Yeah.
properties.
it's it's really cool how, as you said, like things get remixed, and we've talked about this on the show like probably ad nauseum, but I never really get tired of it. Is how these things come in waves. So in the 90s, and David, I'm sure you can talk about this a lot. We have like very distinct sort of graduating um, styles, and an increasing complexity in what can be done with the growing technology. So you start off with games like Doom, and then Quake, and that becomes like now we have 3D worlds like for real, and then we have this transition into like the immersive sim sort of stuff. You have Thief, you have your Deus Ex, all of that, and right now in the retro shooter community, same thing is happening. Like history is literally repeating itself. Where we started off, we had something like Dusk, which is a direct homage to Doom, Quake, that kind of thing, and then and just to keep it on, just talking about New Blood in 3D Realms. Now that we had like Ion Fury, and then now we're gonna see things like Graven or Core Decay, which are much more in that kind of immersive sim territory. Um, it's really bizarre, but as you said, like it's just a remix of what we saw before. It's just coming in waves.
It really is.
Yeah.
I guess entertainment, popular culture in general is kind of cyclical because now, I mean, 10 years ago,
Mhm.
15 years ago for sure, but maybe even 10, you wouldn't have seen a lot of game room tours or NES, Sega Genesis collector videos on YouTube. Now they're everywhere. I'm like, I want to show you my Genesis collection. I'm kind of to the point where I'm like, everybody has one. I've seen it. What else you got? And indie games have kind of done that same thing. Where how did indie gaming really take off? There you go. Is that the classic? There you go, man. That's cream of the crop right there. I was that. Oh, now he's gonna go get his. I have mine over there. I'm at a disadvantage. Um, yes, see, this was like we're bringing back the playground wars of my youth. My best friend and I almost split up because he was Sega and I was Nintendo. I was like, whatever, man. I've got Street Fighter 2, and then Mortal Kombat came on Genesis with the Blood Code, and I was like, all right, yeah, I need to come over and play your Sega Genesis. But this is how indie development really started with 8-bit style platformers, and now they're kind of moving back up into like 16 and 32-bit style. And so I'm not surprised, as you said, with FPS, Dusk was really this homage, not even to Doom, but really Quake. Like Dusk looks like it could have been made in the Quake, in the id Tech engine. And now we're moving into the like Deus Ex style games.
Well, a lot of these games are being made in the Quake engine. Like Doom
Yeah,
Guzzler is
exactly.
in the Quake engine.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think, man, we're really hitting these 3-pointers today because I think I said earlier, like, oh, the reason why I think that games like Doom and Quake have such strong modding communities even today is because they have always made it available. John Carmack had a very strong opinion that just released the source code, and because of that, people have been doing it for like 25 years. So if somebody shows up and they want to work in the Quake engine or they want to work in the Doom engine, there's a bunch of people who are like nearly 30-year experts at this that they could just lean on, where you don't have that same sort of history or I don't know, passing of the torch, generationally speaking, with a lot of these other games that weren't as widely available.
Yeah, that's something actually I talked to. So near the end of Rocket Jump, I talk about how I think one of many reasons these classic FPS games that we're going to talk about in the documentary are still so popular today is because of that culture of giving, of John Carmack saying, here's the Doom source code, make what you will, I want to play what you build now. When Doom 2016 launched, it came with Snap Map, which was a really like bare bones sort of modding map maker, and you couldn't do much with it because Bethesda and id didn't want to let you create your own mods. Because here's the problem with mods, right? To publishers, the longer you can keep a game alive by building your own levels for it, the less likely you are to give them money to buy a new game, and so they don't want to give you those tools. Doom and Quake especially are still going today. I especially love the Doom modding community. I consider Doom the greatest FPS of all time. Just ask Robert. I'm banging on about that at every meeting. Because you can play so much with it. I look at a mod like Brutal Doom. It doesn't even really resemble Doom. It's so different. The gameplay is so different, and yet the fundamentals are still there. And I think that's something that, like, nothing against Call of Duty, but you don't see a mod community teaming in that scene, because there isn't really any way to mod that game unless you're going to get very, very stripped down to the code in that game. Doom, you could make Call of Duty and Doom right now if you wanted to, and it could play just as well.
There's a huge argument back, maybe like 2 years ago within the Quake Champions community, because people like didn't understand that you could, like, how are you going to make a Quake game and not let me make levels for it? That's like half the game to me is I want to make levels for it. But then you realize at some point it's like, well, this game is so fucking high fidelity. Like, unless you've got a supercomputer in your house, you're not going to be able to do this. Like, it's not going to be as widely available anyway, even if they could accomplish that.
It's true, but that something was really something fundamental, something primordial was missing from Quake Champions. It's a great Quake game. It looks like Quake. It feels like Quake. I love playing it. But another little key component, one of those little things that adds a lot, were bots. They didn't ship with bots. And I'm thinking, like, if I'm a pro player, how am I going to jump in the game and learn the maps? I don't want to learn against real humans because they're going to be just running amok all over me. I want to go in with bots, turn them way down so they just kind of stand there and drool, and then I have time to run around the maps, learn the territory, learn the weapon spawns. But that's something that the 90s FPS games, especially those bot-driven games like Quake 3 and UT, did really well. They kind of thought of everything. And then UT took it to the next level by building in mods like, hey, you want to play instagib? Hey, you want to muck around with the gravity? You could do that in Quake by typing in like programming like commands into the console. But UT, you just click, oh, let's play with gravity here, and then go. And then it's like you're running around rocket jumping on the moon. It's awesome.
It's really weird how, I think you said a couple of minutes ago, how the perception, at least from the corporation, is that like if we allow people to mod the game, it's somehow a detriment to them. And look, I am not a millionaire CEO of some giant company who has any vested interest in this, and I'm sure they've calculated it down to the last cent. But there's a reason why people are still buying the original Doom now, and it's not because everybody just wants to play Doom. It's because like, oh, I could use this engine to make whatever I want, and there's a fuck ton of people doing that. Like a lot of people. There's a whole community around this, who are now like, you know, you brought up Brutal Doom. Like Sergeant Mark is making Brutal Fate, which is going to be a commercial game built in the GZ Doom engine. And I've been of the opinion like, you know, ideally, everybody has to buy the game itself to be able to take the WADs and move them over so that they can create their stuff or play the mods at all. And then B is like, why not just have id get with these people and let's just come up with a license, and then people can actually have Steam integrations and things like that with these games, because it's such a, I mean, it's a closed garden to some extent, and I feel like they stand to make money off the modding community without interfering with it, really. Instead of, go ahead.
They do, and I think you're exactly right, and I think they've realized that, because if you look at the most recent re-releases of Doom and Doom 2, especially, I think they came out like in 2019. They actually, like every couple months or so, Bethesda said, hey, here's a mod that you can download for free no matter which version of our re-release you're playing. Like I'm on Switch, and they, you know, John Romero a few years ago made a couple years ago made Sigil, which he described as like, this is sort of what I see as the unofficial 5th episode of Doom. And then Bethesda and ZeniMax actually reached out to him and said, why don't we just give this away for free? And then it kind of becomes the unofficial, official, or officially unofficial 5th episode of Doom. And that's like, it might seem a minor thing, but to me that was a big step, because I'm like, wow, this is the first time that Bethesda, as the new owner of id, I say new, but they bought them like 12 years ago, has made an overture to any semblance of a modding community to say, hey, let's add on to this game that you've already given us money for, which is usually taboo in those big corporations. So to me, it's really promising of good things that still to come.
You bring that up. I believe the other show that I produce, one of the other shows that I produce, is called Doom is Dead, and it's by the Multiplayer Doom Federation guys. Shout out to them. And also excellently produced show. I'd say that the guy who does all the editing for that is really, really good, because he's me. And but I remember, as you said that, I remember they had Dr. Sean on from Odamex, and I believe he was involved. He was like one of the guys that was involved in porting some of those mods over to the recently re-released versions of Doom 1 and 2.
Yeah.
And there's industry here. There's a lot to be done.
There is. The fans. I mean, yeah, you're right. Like, you're never going to find anyone more passionate than fans. That's what Robin realized when he reached out and assembled our teams. Like, we're all doing this because we love this. I mean, even our Slack, Robin's like, well, what do we think about this game? And then, like, he has to kind of, we derail his discussion, because for half an hour we're talking about, oh, do you remember this level? And do you remember this gun? And we're just, like, gushing about it.
Very frustrating.
Very frustrating for you, not for us. We're having fun. This is the sort of documentary we're going to make, where it's just going to be even the developers. You know, John Romero is such a passionate guy. He's a historian himself. You can ask him about any FPS, and he'll just gush about it. Not from the perspective of, man, you're talking about Duke Nukem 3D, but you were kind of competing with them. He doesn't see it like that. He's just like, this is what this game did, and oh, I wish Quake would have done this because Duke Nukem 3 did it, or it did it so much better. Like, it's just there's this excitement. Developers started as fans, and there's again we're coming back to that cyclical nature of everything. Fans make the games, and the games make the fans. That's how it should work.
Well, what would have been id without 3D Realms and Apogee and vice versa? Like if they didn't,
Exactly.
it's like having WWE without a competitor. We saw that for 15 years after WCW crashed, and it sucked.
It was
And
bad.
now that AEW's back, nobody's pulling the punches anymore. It's everybody's having to work hard. WWE is acting like they don't exist. AEW, meanwhile, is just like, we're better than the competition, and we know it, and racking up all the money in the fans. And without that, I mean, capitalism doesn't work without competition. However you feel about capitalism, uh, nothing really works without competition. If you don't have your brother to wrestle with you when you're a kid, how are you going to learn how to wrestle? Like,
That's true. You're so right. I'm thinking back to like
yeah,
body slamming my brother on our trampolines and watching him tumble through the air. You're exactly right.
yeah,
That's how I
yeah.
became the professional wrestler I am today. So.
I'm proud of you, but I mean, just in
What's
general,
your wrestling name? What's your wrestling name?
Okay, I've actually thought about this. I am prototype because I am the blueprint of the future. Boom.
that
There's my
is the
catchphrase.
that's John Cena's original
I
name.
know, but I'm better than John Cena. I even took
Oh,
the protoplex. I'm like, nah, John Cena, don't use a protoplex. We're gonna call. I don't remember what I called mine, but I had a whole character built out. I actually liked. We're gonna go off. We're still on a tangent. This is like Robin's. Like this is our Slack chat room come to life right now. But I really liked.
This is my word.
I loved the ruthless aggression era. I'm a huge Randy Orton mark. I don't care who knows it. And someone should tell Monday Night Raw that there's competition because even SmackDown's kicking their ass right now. But
If we're talking about AEW, I've got to tell you that I worked quite closely with Chris Jericho. So we
what does
did
his dick taste like?
you know what? I've got a random story. I ended up on a
Oh
Zoom
no!
chat. Okay, it doesn't involve anything like that, but like, um, I ended up on a Zoom call with Peter Weller, aka RoboCop, and Chris Jericho, because Peter Weller, I was skyping into our studio in Los Angeles, where we shoot a lot of our interviews, and those two crossed over. And that was
oh,
a very bizarre moment in my life, being on a three-way chat with Peter Weller and Chris Jericho. But we did a Chris Jericho edition, a collector's edition of our In Search of Darkness Part 2, and he's in it. He is a crazy, crazy horror fan
Yeah,
and knows his shit. Like
he's like really good friends with Eli Roth too.
yeah, like he
Yeah,
is on point. Like I mean, I wasn't that familiar with him as a sports entertainer, right? But like legit expert level on 80s horror and charismatic as hell. He was wonderful. Yeah.
I learned about a lot of those like Italian horror movies from the '80s because I read Chris Jericho's biography, and he was talking about him and Eli Roth were reading or watching Cannibal Holocaust and stuff like that, and I was like, what is this? And that took me on a whole journey. Like that was kind of a dark period. Those are not really fun movies, to be honest with you, but like I
No,
get it. Um,
but he makes them when he talks about them, like the two, I suppose, famous super fans that we had in those documentaries was Corey Taylor from Slipknot.
oh
Uh,
yeah,
he's actually a producer with me, and Chris Jericho, and those two are buddies as well. So
that is so funny that you just said those two names in succession like that. Because I was talking with the Realms Deep crew, and I asked Zach, like, hey, can you get me in contact with those FPS Doc guys? I think that'd be really fun. And I was like, I'm already going to be in the Postal documentary. I need to like become one of these like kind of regular talk. That's good marketing, like the always dependable talking head guy, which is Chris Jericho, Sebastian Bach and Corey Taylor in every VH1 music documentary ever made.
Corey's the real deal, man. Like
Yeah.
he I actually just emailed him last week because we were trying to get connected with Trent Reznor,
Mm-hmm.
and I
Good luck.
couldn't find any angles, and he didn't know him. He was like, "Look, I'm going to ask around and see if I can get you hooked up." But um, in terms of rock stars that I've come into, like legit rock stars that I've come into contact with, he's the real deal. He's just a really humble guy, and we stuck him in a studio in Las Vegas for like 4 hours, and he didn't miss a beat. Like he was on point, and he loves it. It's such that era of filmmaking left such an impression on him. To the point where in Slipknot, the guys that design the masks, that's Tom Savini, who is like the 80s horror FX
Yeah.
guy. So it comes back and full circle. But yeah, amazing experience.
Isn't it interesting how the same rule that I said earlier in my first 3-pointer applies here? The generation of guys that were making the best music in the 90s again grew up watching that shit in the 80s. It was a really special time. And it just influences everything after it. And it never really went away. I mean, there's still some really good shit in the 90s movie wise, but I feel like you're right. It just took a different direction. I think like Pulp Fiction was probably the nail in the coffin for or Reservoir Dogs, maybe even for a lot of that
It's
stuff.
interesting. We do want to do a 90s. There's In Search of Darkness 1 and 2, and we're going to development on part 3. I never dreamt I'd be doing a part 3, but the audience wants it. So we're doing part 3, and that's really going to focus on the VHS era, like the stuff that never made it close to a cinema. We're going to sort of double down on that. But the 90s is something we want to cover because obviously the 80s was the last bastion of practical effects.
Yeah.
And a lot of those effects now look great still, like they're timeless. But when you get to the 90s, it's the birth of CGI. And so a lot of the material from the 90s really is dated very, very poorly now.
Exactly.
But, again, with this sort of revisionist recontextualizing a whole decade of horror, there's going to be some amazing films you've never seen, right? Which we want to bring to your attention as a horror fan or as a film fan. And that's going to be the challenge. And also 90s nostalgia is absolutely huge right now. So nostalgia works in 30-year cycles. So all the directors
turning that
and
age now.
filmmakers, all the directors and filmmakers of the 80s were inspired by all the sci-fi and horror from the 50s. You just ask Joe Dante about that, and he'll give you a great answer.
Klaatu Barada Nektu is that's everybody remembers it from The Evil Dead, but that's from The Day the Earth Stood Still. Exactly, and that's a 30-year cycle.
30 years cycle, and it's amazing. I mean, I love it. I think nostalgia is very, very powerful, right? And I think that when I think about FPS and the film we want to make, we want it to feel nostalgic. We want you to feel nostalgic. And we want you to fall in love with it all over again.
Yeah, I mean, it's, just to your point, I mean, who is Duke Nukem if not Bruce Campbell with more guns, right? Like, hail to the king, time to kick ass and chew bubble gum. And I mean, Doom was inspired chiefly by Aliens, not the first one, but the second one. And I mean, all this stuff does go in cycles. And I think there's so much synergy between, the early types of movies, sci-fi and horror movies, and especially FPS games. And just speaking to the timelessness of it, taking it back to Doom, as I always do, I was helping my fellow producer Richard Moss get some capture footage earlier this week, and for the first time I played the Aliens Total Conversion for Doom, which had been out since I was 11, 12 years old and played this game, but I'd never gotten to play it because I didn't really have access to the internet until like a couple years later. And it's still really creepy. And this is a mod that's played in the 1993 game engine, but so atmospheric, and it's just really cool. Right back then, it made me feel the way I felt playing Doom for the first time, which I considered as much a horror game as I did an action shooter. And it's just really cool to kind of, when you take the 40,000 foot view, to see how all this stuff in popular culture, all the connective tissue that binds it together.
I find it very interesting that like we've just been talking about like that era of games the whole time, and, and so for you as the historian, why is it that the later things, and especially the modern stuff, isn't hitting as hard? And I don't think we're going to be talking about a lot of these games in the same way that are currently coming out in 30 years, the same way that we're talking about Doom. And we'll probably still be talking about Doom. We'll probably still be talking about Quake. I will.
Yeah.
I'm curious though.
I think because there are several reasons there. It's a great question. The first is that, id released Doom in 93, Doom 2 a year later, And then Final Doom came out in 96 as a fan package. And then Doom went moribund until 2004, where Doom 3 was kind of divisive. I really liked it, but I'm a horror buff as well. And so I appreciated what it set out to do. It was flawed, but, no masterpiece is perfect. And then it went moribund again until 2016. Call of Duty, there's a new one every year. I could not tell you off the top of my head the Call of Duty from 3, 4, 5 years ago. I can't keep track of them. And I think that's one reason why Activision doesn't want you to get too attached to any one Call of Duty. They want you to play this one until the next one comes out, and then they want your $60 for that one. And I'm not knocking that franchise, but it's really hard to get attached to individual games when you are oversaturating your own market with them. Nintendo does this too. There's not a new Mario game every year. If there was, we would get tired of Mario. We'd get tired of Zelda. That is why Doom is still special, because every now and then, there are people like me who are always playing it. I play Doom at least once a year because it's just fun to relax with now. But every now and then, John Romero will come back and make an unofficial map pack for it. And that, boom, it's back in the news. Or a modder like Sergeant Mark IV will come around and do something with it like Brutal Doom, and boom, it's back in the news. I don't know when the last time was I heard someone talk about Call of Duty 4. That game is hugely influential, but it's not really part of the zeitgeist anymore because so much more has come out since then. That I talked earlier about flavors. There's so many flavors of FPS from the 90s and the early 2000s. I feel like, BioShock and the Orange Box came out within months of weeks, really, in some cases, as Call of Duty 4. I kind of consider those the last of that era, when Call of Duty 4 was so hugely popular that, even Capcom took their horror franchise, Resident Evil, and were like, we want the Call of Duty audience. And then Resident Evil 5 and 6 came out, and they were just kind of abominations because they didn't know what they were. They had this total loss of identity.
It's so funny because Resident Evil 5, for a lot of people, I'm like, have you ever played Resident Evil? And they're like, yeah, I played 5, because the co-op was really good.
Yes.
And also
it's my favorite co-op game of all time, so I'm contradicting myself, but, yeah.
But it totally just missed the mark. 5 and 6 were nothing, especially coming off of 4, which to me is like the greatest game ever made.
Yep.
Like, wow.
And that's the thing, right? Like, with also, Robin was talking about excess earlier. Mm-hmm. The 90s FPS genre was kind of like that, but in terms of creativity rather than money. Yeah. You didn't have to sell 10 million copies just to break even. You could sell, like Doom sold, I think it took them a while to even hit 1 million, because back then the bar was so much lower. And all these other studios, what would be considered AAA studios, could make games. They could sell between 500,000 to 1 million copies and be satisfied with that, have made a profit from that, buy Ferraris from that, and it was fine. But today, like Doom, Resident Evil 6, that series tanked for a while because Resident Evil 6 only sold like 6 million copies. That was considered a failure. Yeah. And so, because publishing is risk averse, you have to go with what works. And so they, soon there was no one left to really copy Call of Duty. There was just always Call of Duty. And they really didn't start to change the formula until the buy-in rate every year started to drop and drop and drop and drop. Now you have these indie FPS games like Dusk, like Ion Fury, where it's not just nostalgia that's part of it, but there's more creativity again. There's more flavor again. That's what excites me. I love those games, and it's because of the creativity. I never know what I'm going to see from one level to the next, and that's another hallmark of the 90s FPS. Like, people complain, well, Quake didn't have a story. My answer is, who cares? The levels were the stories. The exploration and the encounters, those were the stories. It was non-authorial storytelling. It was the story was your experience playing the game, your experience with 3 of your buddies on the couch next to you in your dorm room playing Halo 2 all night in deathmatch, and your crazy kills with the laser sword. Those are the stories. That was the fun. But you can't really have that now unless you're turning to indie games. Even a few years ago, Microsoft announced that they were taking split screen out of Halo 5, I think, and the community was just like, come on, that's been there since the beginning. What are you going to, no split screen? I can't play with my kids. I can't play with my friends. That's how we played it. That's how we played it when I was in college or whatever.
All you got to do is just go buy another PlayStation and another TV.
That's what they want you to do. And another copy of the game and another Xbox Live subscription. And it just adds up. It's excess that doesn't work in favor of the fans. And that's when it gets troubling for me.
Absolutely. I mean, that's why I'm so staunch about the indie stuff. Like, that's all this podcast really has been about, is
Hmm.
let's talk about the people who are doing this, because I think they're smarter than they realize, and many of them like are just kind of like, they're just doing it out of necessity. Like, this is just what I have to do to be a game developer. But it's
Right.
like, no, your return on investment is going to be much bigger than another project who, if you can market it effectively, your return on investment's way higher because you're not investing anything in the beginning.
Right.
It's costing you your time.
Right.
And if you have, like, a Patreon or a Kickstarter or something like what you guys are doing, it's not your 50 grand. You know, you're not gonna die uh, because your investors are gonna come at you with a torch and a pitchfork or whatever. Like, it's a much easier way to kind of do it. In my case, the same thing. I'm not putting any money into our games, other than just paying the developers. That's
Hmm.
it. It's all
There's
about
something to be said about crowdfunding. That's very unique, because I don't look at our backers as investors, because it's not equity crowdfunding, it's rewards based crowdfunding. But I think that having backers makes you accountable. It has to make you accountable. And it's like the group kinetic energy drives the project forward. So we have a synopsis internally, we have a proposition on Kickstarter, all of those kind of things. That 100% is going to develop and iterate via our backer base, because we will go to them and say, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? It will make its way into how we develop the experience for that group of people. And that's what's really powerful about crowdfunding. Like, it's, I'm not buying a DVD or a Blu-ray off the shelf for 10 bucks, right? I'm actually making something happen. By backing a project or supporting a creator on Patreon, you're helping manifest something, and that changes the relationship between you and the work. So our backers, I see as, I'm trying to think the right word, but that they are part of the project. They're they're contributors, but their names are in the project. It's part of them. It's we see this, people framing the posters, taking screenshots of the credits and posting it on Instagram with like arrows to like, this is me, because it's a reflection of who they are. It's all about identity and who you align with. And that's why crowdfunding is such a powerful tool if you approach it in the right way. I would hate to do this in a to do this type of project in a vacuum, because it wouldn't turn out right. We need the audience to co-create with us.
What's really interesting is, like, you guys said you have like 500 backers, something like that at this point.
And
Pro-
right now,
yeah,
because
probably a lot more, like, by the time this airs. But yeah,
so we're 3 days in, right, and we have literally 3 days, and we've just hit 509 backers, right, which is pretty good.
but let's do the math here. Think about how much money we're talking about and how many people that is. That's how much those people care or and
Um,
can afford to help. That's
yeah.
insane.
So as of right now, where are we? The 2nd of July, we've raised £42,319, which is about $55,000, which is really good. Um, so yeah, like, it's, how do I put it? It's sort of, obviously the more resource we have, the more we can do. But we part of our proposition is to have a Discord exclusively for backers, and we want them to feel like they're part of this. We're a very flat structure, we're very approachable, and we're going to talk about the project. When you back one of our projects, it's about going on the journey with us and feeling part. That's part of what we sell. It's part of that experience. And I think that's what's unique about these kind of projects, is that you're not just going to. I hope people don't just back us and then wait for the Blu-ray to arrive in the post, right? A lot of people do that. That's fine, but I think you're missing out on the full extent of the experience, which is actually, we want to hear from you. We want to know what you want to see. And what's wonderful is when you start a project like this, people start coming out of the woodwork. I've been getting emails from designers, from composers who are just like, "This sounds really cool. Can I help?" And I'm like, "Yes, please." This is what this is all about. It's ultimately fan driven. Look at what you're doing with the show and the chats you guys are having. You're like having a blast. You know, like it's fun. This is what I love doing and being part of. I really do.
Yeah, so we're like almost an hour in, and I know David, you have other shit you got to do, but this has been really fun, and I'm kind of mind blown just seeing this project. This is not something I ever really thought was going to happen. Like seeing a full on documentary, a 3 hour plus doc. I figured there'd be an FPS documentary, but I figured it'd be like an hour or whatever, like Netflix thing that doesn't really service to the fans the way it should.
Mhm.
Or is like limited by some corporation's idea of what it ought to be, and this is beautiful. And where I kind of want to leave off is, what is it that made you want to do this in the first place? What made you want to be a documentarian, and what made you want to kind of like catalog all of this information? And that question is for both of you, but start
I'll
with
let Robin
yeah.
take it first. Yeah.
Honestly, I'd always worked in television and making documentaries has been my career. But I
Mm-hmm.
set up I kind of veered off in my 20s and ran a corporate media company. And I hit 40 and I felt really disconnected with what I was doing. And basically, I was like, look, I want to work on something I really care about. The first documentary I produced with this group, CREATORVC, was about 80s action movies called In Search of the Last Action Heroes. And I remember the first day of putting that together, and I was like, man, I'm loving my life. This is so much fun, and it just snowballed. And um, there's no rules. We got no rules. We're not beholden to anybody apart from our backers, so we can make these films as long as we want. We don't care. Like we want to indulge kind of super fans, and because I only work on stuff that I care about. Going back to what I said earlier, Halo 2, the whole Halo franchise for me is something that had a profound effect. I'm not a gamer. I've got that terrible issue of being not very good and competitive. So actually playing FPS games is a hugely frustrating experience for me personally. But just the visceral experience, the world building, the characters, I remember my heart beating playing this game, and sweating and the adrenaline. I'm like, wow, it blew my mind. And um, that's what prompted me to look into producing an FPS documentary because there's so much there. It's got all the drama, it's got the imagery, the iconography, the characters. It's up there with movies. It's probably more immersive than movies. And you've probably spent more time in that environment than you have watching movies. And the way we covered movies, we did it right, and I want to see that for gaming. And I think that FPS is the perfect genre to do that with. And it's really exciting. And I'm so hyped. And just being on this show now, chatting to you about it, like I feel so grateful because I'm having such a blast.
it's it's definitely like, remove the word shooter from it even, but just the first person experience in gaming. I mean, when that first happened, that is as close to true immersion as we get until they figure out VR technology to make
But
it
it's
like
mad, right? I remember playing for hours and then closing my eyes, and I'd close my eyes and I'd still see the reticle, and
yeah.
like it would be imprinted on my mind. I had a girlfriend I had at the time used to get really cross with me for playing Halo 2 for hours and ignoring her, and it was,
Yeah.
there's nothing like it, and I look at it as high. The way that people look at cinema and they put that on a pedestal as an experience as art, right? Without sort of getting fancy, I think that gaming, full stop, should be elevated, and that's how we're looking at FPS. We're looking at master craftspeople that have put this together, made their imaginations real. That's mind blowing to me. I love it.
I think gaming, part of what makes it special anyway is the fact that it is the coming together of many different art forms. It's not just what you're playing. It's like the artwork, the music, the cinematic experience, there's voice, there's actors involved in many of these things. There's computer science. There's so many different things coming together with a film. And nothing wrong with films. I love films, but like it's linear. It's just this kind of like thing that you're looking at on a screen and you don't interact with it. So the interactability of games is also, it just makes you feel more connected to it. And it's hard to quantify, but there's certainly a reason why it's so pervasive throughout culture. Since, I mean, I was born in 95 and I don't remember any time when video games didn't exist, but like there was a transitionary period at some point.
Yeah, that's why I do this. I've been professional writer, meaning for a paycheck most of the time,
Mm-hmm.
for 17 years, and I write. I found my niche. I've write and published fiction as well, but in terms of nonfiction, I love to write the stories of how these games were made because, surprisingly, full accounts aren't out there. One of the foundational books in my career is David Kushner's Masters of Doom in 2003. I love that book. Everybody loves that book. But when I was writing Rocket Jump, I don't like to retread ground. I like to find new angles on stories, or I just say, well, I'm going to find another one that hasn't been told. But Rocket Jump, David Kushner wrote about Quake, but that was near the end of the book. It was really about Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. And so I said, well, Rocket Jump will start with Quake. So I want to write a sort of spiritual successor to Masters of Doom. And that's what I think Rocket Jump is. And I've done that with other companies on the games as well. Some of my bestsellers have been the Stay While and Listen series about Blizzard and Diablo, Warcraft, and StarCraft. I'm working on one right now about Mortal Kombat that I announced earlier this year, and that'll be out. The publisher wants it out, I think, late next winter for that franchise's 30th anniversary. And I'm telling all these cool stories, and as a storyteller, there's nothing better. So when I met Robin, I've been thinking for a long time. I'm like, I love to write books. It's my lifeblood, but I want to explore other realms of storytelling, and that's what FPS and some other documentaries we've been spitballing will give me the opportunity to help do. I'll get to tell stories in other mediums, and I can't think of anything better to do with my time, honestly, than to be creating and telling stories.
I keep saying to David, meeting you was a complete gift. And there's some guys who made a documentary which is coming out pretty soon about GoldenEye, and they guys based down in Melbourne, Australia, and they privately messaged me and they said, "Listen, David is like a really good contributor, right? And like he's really helped this film come together." So that's sort of in the back of my mind as well. But this is like it. Good ideas deserve to be born. Like you start with something very small and you see it build and build and build and build, and you get that momentum. And that's what we're witnessing right now with this project. And it's like the most fun at work I could possibly have.
Same. And it's very flattering to hear stuff like that. And I think that's why you have teams like ours that work so well. We're all doing this because what else would we be doing? We can't imagine not doing it. It's just
Not
it's so
having
much
as
fun.
much fun.
Yeah, it really is. It really is a ton of fun. Especially, it's nice to see the fruits of your labors pay off. The Kickstarter is doing so well, and the fan engagement. They're asking a lot of the same questions. They're asking about the same contributors that we foresaw, and that's because we're kind of on the same wavelength. We know what fans want because we're fans ourselves. So it's been pretty cool to be a part of that.
It's been a wild fucking journey for me too, in the same regard. Like I can't imagine not doing this. I completely understand that feeling, and there are times when you're just like, why do I do that? Why do I wake up at before I want to go interview people that live across the world about an FPS documentary or whatever, and simply because I really want to, like number one, and then number two is just like whatever comes after that. Slowly building up, and that's one of the cool things is that you're talking about, like how if you hadn't met David or whatever, you end up meeting all these incredible people who become important either because they're friends or like later on they bring it back like, hey man, I remember you because you did this amazing. interview, or you had me in the film, and I just wanted to show you something new. And maybe that's the thing that just jumpstarts the next segment of your life. It's all tangential and interconnected and beautiful. I love what you guys are doing, and I
So
can't wait to see
the
it.
real FPS documentary is the friends we made along the way.
Oh, that's
Right.
such a nice way to sign off.
Right.
I feel like we have to end it.
Yeah. Yeah. Can we edit that bit out?
That's the end of the show.
Yeah.
Peace, love, rockets. Oh, I'll
That's
probably
your next book.
Yeah.
Peace, love, rockets. There we go.
That's the QuakeCon mantra. If you've never been, I don't know that we're ever going to have another real QuakeCon again.
Oh, I hope. I love QuakeCon.
But we got Realms Deep, and I'm balls deep in that. So let's just do it.